Hello, my name is Matthew Reed and I'm the Group Head of Digital at Space and Time, and today I'm going to be talking to you about the death of third-party cookies. So within this session, we're going to talk about exactly what's happening, why third-party cookies are going away, when that's likely to happen, and some of the issues that could potentially cause. However, we're also going to go through a lot of the solutions that are coming into play that will fix most of those issues. We also, within this session, have a little roadmap for you, which kind of outlines what you should do over the next year to prepare for the end of third-party cookies. We'll go through this in more detail at the end of the session, but for now, the first part of this is essentially to attend this training, so we'll jump right in. To start with, what is a cookie? Well, a cookie is a small piece of data that is stored on your computer by a web browser while you're browsing websites, and it's used to identify the device. So essentially, you visit a website, it stores a cookie on your browser, and it can then identify you uniquely, your device, when you visit that website again or you browse around the internet. It's unique to you, and it's used to exchange information between the website you visited and, at the moment, other websites as well. So cookies are essentially used on two fronts. Firstly, to understand what you do on that individual website, pages you visit, goals you complete, how long you stay there, but also to understand what you do around the internet. What are you interested in? What are your hobbies? Who are you? And obviously that can be used for advertising purposes. So when we talk about cookies, there are essentially two main types that we refer to: first-party cookies and third-party cookies. So with first-party cookies, this is set by the individual website you visit, and it's used by that website to understand what you did there. So essentially, a website drops a cookie on you so that when you're there, it can understand, well, what pages did you view? How long did you spend there? Did you complete any goals? It can also then understand if you then return to the website at a later date. Third-party cookies, on the other hand, are set by companies that you didn't visit. So it's set by other domains, not the individual website you visited. And then these are used to understand what you're doing on that website, plus what you're doing on lots of other websites around the web, to get a kind of fuller view of you as an individual, to be able to serve relevant ads to you. So first thing to note, first-party cookies aren't going anywhere. There's no plan at the moment to get rid of them. They might do eventually, but right now it is only third-party cookies that we're planning to live without. So we don't need to worry about that first-party side, and everything that they're used for, things like analytics and whatnot, to understand what happens on your own site. There's no issue there. It's just the third-party side. Now, I understand that that can be a little complex of how they're set. So just to demonstrate that in a bit more detail, with a first-party cookie, this is the kind of user journey. So a user would go to a website. When they're on that website, the server recognizes that person has landed, and it assigns a cookie to the browser and gives it a unique ID. So it recognizes that person has come to this website and tracks them again as they go around and view certain pages, take certain actions on that individual website. Because that cookie is then set on that user's browser, if they leave and then come back to the website, the server then recognizes that. It recognizes that that cookie has reappeared, so it doesn't have to drop a new one. It can then see you as a returning visitor rather than a new visitor. So this is really useful, obviously, great for things like analytics, because when you go to a website, it's the way in which the website can track what you're doing there, and that's totally fine. With third-party cookies is the fact that third parties come into play. So the journey starts the same. You as an individual might go to a website and that server drops a first-party cookie on you, but at the same time, other companies also drop cookies on you, even though you haven't visited their site, and they use that to track information about you and obviously build a profile about you. The way that works is that individual website might, for example, have ads on the website using something like Google AdSense, or it might have, say, social media buttons like a Facebook like button. Within those buttons that are supplied by a third party, they also have cookies that can drop on you as an individual. So if you think about, say, Google AdSense, which supplies ads for publishers all around the world for billions of sites, it will drop a cookie on you when you visit a site because it's there, even though you haven't visited Google AdSense, obviously. And then as you browse around other sites that also have Google AdSense, it can see your cookie ID when you visit those others. So it can start to build a picture of you of what you're doing online. So let's say you visit 10 websites that all have Google AdSense. It knows that it was your ID that visited those 10 and can start to build a picture of you're interested in X, Y, and Z, and you might be about to purchase something, and so on and so forth. And then obviously that can be used for advertisers to target relevant audiences. So it's these third-party cookies that are going away. And when you sound it out like that, it does sound a little odd, and there is obviously reasons why we're concerned about them. Essentially, the reason they're going away is because people have taken their own internet privacy more and more into their own hands and are worried about it more than ever. You can see from the stat there that 81% of Americans think that the potential risk of data collection by companies outweighs any benefits. And that's a really interesting point, because what we know from a lot of studies is that people do really respond well to tailored ads, to ads that are relevant to them as an individual. And people actually do prefer seeing ads that are more relevant to them than seeing completely unrelated ads. However, at the same time, more than ever, people are worried about their online security and want to take privacy back into their own hands. And the thing with third-party cookies is they're just not that secure. There is a lot of security elements within them, but essentially it's a bit of an open platform. Data can be spread all over the place, and it's just technology that's outdated and needs to move on. So a lot of the solutions we're going to look at throughout this presentation kind of work in a similar way to third-party cookies, in that we will still have data collection, we will still have relevant audiences, but it'll all be done in a much more secure way. So in terms of when this is going to happen, well, funnily enough, this has already started to happen on some browsers. You can see from this timeline that for Safari and Firefox, this has already happened. It's happening now. But really the big one is Google Chrome. So Google Chrome makes up close to 70% of all browsing behavior online. And Google have kind of said that they plan to depreciate third-party cookies in January next year. So that's really the big timeline that we're working towards, because that's when we will really see the impact of third-party cookies going away. Now, in terms of what will be impacted, or I suppose what could be impacted if solutions aren't in place, we've kind of chosen to focus on a few areas today for this talk, which we feel are the most important. So firstly, we have audience targeting, and this comes back to that kind of primary function of third-party cookies, which is to understand behavior online and therefore define you as audiences. So for example, Google and other companies might build an audience based off third-party cookies of people who have been viewing different housing websites and identify them as likely to be in the market to buy a house. So that audience targeting is really powerful from an advertising point of view, because we can then choose to target that audience and go after people that are identified as looking to buy a house. So that all relies on third-party cookies at the moment. So we'll look at what's going to happen with that and potential solutions. Then we have a load of others, so things like frequency capping. This is making sure that we don't just serve the same ad to one user over and over again each day. We don't want a user to say see the same ad 20 times a day. And at the moment, we would use third-party cookies to say once the user has say seen the ad 3 times, stop showing it to them. We also have retargeting. So although retargeting is based off first-party information of that user has, say, been to our website, and then we want to show them ads again because they didn't quite convert, the mechanisms behind it still do rely on third-party cookies a lot of the time. Along the bottom, we then have kind of more on tracking and measurement and insights. And that's a really important point as well, because although, again, a lot of measurement and tracking is using first-party cookies and first-party data, a lot also relies on third-party cookies, especially if people are jumping from different devices and tying that up together. But also if we want to understand more insights about the users who've been to our website. So we might use first-party cookies to understand what they've done on our site, but then we might use third-party data to understand more information about that audience to gather more insights about them. So these are some of the areas that would be impacted if, say, all third-party cookies were just turned off today and there was no solution. I think the first thing to kind of lay out right now is that we are not here telling you that all of this stuff is going to go away or that there's going to be a massive issue with any of this. Obviously, the community within the digital marketing industry is very aware of everything that's happening and working on solutions. And the ultimate thing is, don't forget that Google, who will be depreciating third-party cookies next year, they are also the ones who run Google Ads, DV360, and their primary revenue stream is digital advertising. So it's of course well within their scope to get solutions for all of this before that depreciation comes along. We're going to talk in a little bit about the Google Sandbox project, the privacy sandbox, and that is basically the big overarching project from Google, to which a lot of the solutions for all of this will come out of. But Google obviously aren't the only ones coming up with solutions for all of this. It's an industry-wide thing, and lots of companies are looking at how we can move to a better future without third-party cookies. So again, before we go into the individual solutions, it's worth noting at this point that there isn't one solution. So it's not that we're talking about cookies going away and one other thing coming in to replace cookies. There has been talk of lots of different things, whether it be fingerprint IDs, email addresses and whatnot to replace, but it's not as simple as that. So rather than it just being one central replacement for third-party cookies, what's likely to happen is there will be a number of different solutions. And they're not all out yet. You know, this is still early days. There's still a lot of development going on, and there's loads to come over the next year. So we're going to talk through today some potential solutions that are already being worked on and that we think will be, you know, primary solutions come next year. But there will be lots more than this, and it will develop over time. It's also worth noting again at this point that the whole point of this is not to get rid of ad customization or to stop advertisers from targeting kind of qualified audiences. It's just about safety and giving greater privacy to users. So you can see at the bottom of there, the kind of mantra is we want a safer, more controlled environment that is still fully customizable because we know how important that is, but it puts privacy at its heart. So that's where we're aiming to. And I personally believe, and I think most in the industry do believe, that where we can be post third-party cookie depreciation is in a place where we still have customization, we still have great audience targeting, we still have excellent digital marketing, actually if not better, but just works in a much better way that users can be much more comfortable with and not worry so much about their own privacy. So let's jump into some solutions. Now, a really basic one that has been around for years and years and years, but is one of the many solutions to the issue of audience targeting, is contextual targeting. So again, with audience targeting, it's all about picking out that audience of relevant people and targeting them as they browse the web. So if we use buying a car as an example, at the moment, third-party cookies might be used to pick up all people that look like they're in the market to buy a car. So this could be based on the fact that they've looked on different car review sites, they've looked on different car websites themselves, and that they're, you know, even booking appointments at showrooms and whatnot. And third-party cookies pick up all of that information and group together a load of users and say, these people are all in market to buy a car. And then as advertisers, we could then target that audience and say, show them ads for cars. So that's the third-party cookie side. The thing with that, though, is although you're targeting a super relevant audience of people who look like they're going to buy a car, when you target that audience, you might be targeting that blanketly across the whole web. So the individual, although being identified as someone who wants to buy a car, at the time they're seeing the ad, they might be on something like Sky News or Sky Sports or, you know, any number of sites, different blogs or whatnot. They might be reading a parenting blog. They might be, you know, looking at banking, whatever it might be. But because you're targeting them as a relevant audience, you are just going after them no matter what they're looking at. And it makes sense because they're in market to buy a car. They just might not be thinking about it right at the point that you are showing them an ad. The flip side of that is contextual targeting. So if we think about, well, okay, what if we couldn't pick out the audience of people who we know are interested in buying a car? How else would we reach potential car buyers? Well, the obvious answer is we'll go to relevant car buying websites. So rather than targeting the audience, let's target the content that that audience are likely to read when wanting to buy a car. So that might be something like carreviews.com. So rather than saying we'll target everyone who we know is interested, we'll put our ad on carreviews.com because it's likely that the people on there are also interested in buying a car. Now that's super relevant in terms of the context is great. The contextual targeting is 100% because we're only targeting websites that are about buying a car. However, because we're not doing the audience targeting, we can't tell if the person seeing the ad is right at the start of their journey and just thinking about maybe buying one in the next couple of years, or if they're really keen on buying one in the next couple of months. So they both have their pros and cons, but contextual targeting can be done without the use of third-party cookies. It is used widely at the moment anyway, but it's one that could definitely be used more and more next year when third-party cookies have gone away. The other thing to note with contextual targeting is it still allows for other enhancements like location, time of day, and even the ad position on the website. But yeah, it just doesn't rely on that third-party cookie. However, as mentioned already, we don't expect audience targeting to go out the window. Definitely not. And there are going to be lots of solutions for that. Contextual is just one that already exists. So Google Privacy Sandbox. Now, this is a project created by Google to kind of address this whole wider issue of privacy and the death of third-party cookies. And you can see the quote there that its mission is to create a thriving web ecosystem that is respectful of users and private by default. Now, Privacy Sandbox as a whole is going to spit out lots of different projects. We're going to talk about another one in a little bit called Turtle Dove, but it will spit out lots of different projects to kind of address all those different issues that we mentioned at the start. But obviously, one of the very, very key ones is audience targeting. Now, the idea within Privacy Sandbox at the moment is that it will still allow for audience targeting like we have now. So let's say you wanted to go after that group of people likely to buy a car, you could still go after that people, but rather than that audience having been defined by third-party cookies, essentially it would be defined by their browser behavior still, but not stored in third-party cookies, but stored in a private walled garden by Google. So in other words, Google would still monitor all that information, but it would keep it all completely private, completely anonymized, and then allow advertisers to use that information to advertise, but they would essentially be the gatekeeper. Now, that is very similar to third-party cookies, but it's just much more private. It's all controlled and regulated by Google in a walled garden, and so you don't just have random cookies all over the place that no one can really keep track of. It would also mean from an individual user's point of view, rather than them having to maybe contact loads of different sites if they wanted to delete all of their kind of data that's being held by them, it would be kind of one central place where a user could say to Google, I don't want this information stored about me, get rid of it, and then Google again would be the gatekeeper of that. So there's not a huge amount of information on this at the moment, and more will develop over the next year, but the Privacy Sandbox will definitely be spitting out a few solutions to audience targeting across Google Ads and DV360. So this will definitely account for a lot of those issues that we could face if third-party cookies were just, say, deleted tomorrow. Now, another solution to audience targeting, kind of slightly on the flip side of Google, is Unified ID 2.0. Now, this is a solution that is being created by the Trade Desk, and in a way, it's kind of an encounter to Google and Facebook and Amazon and those big tech giants. Obviously, with the Privacy Sandbox, one of the key things there is that it would be a walled garden controlled by Google, and so they would hold all the chips, as it were. So what the Trade Desk are proposing is, rather than having to use those walled gardens, what if they create one that any advertising company could have access to, as long as it kind of stuck to the principles of privacy and regulation? So this would use email addresses rather than cookies. What that means is that let's say you go to a website and you want to read a bit of content and it's behind either a paywall or a login wall, and you submit your email address. You might at that time be asked to consent into advertising relevant ads. And if you do, that information would be stored in a secure and private place. It wouldn't share your email address with anyone else, but it would use that email address to ID you like a cookie does when you browse around the web. Now, advertising companies would then be able to use that information to build audiences for us to advertise against. Again, very similar to cookies, but the difference being that that data is all stored in a very secure place. The user has complete transparency. Again, they can come in and say, get rid of my data. I don't want to be advertised to anymore. Or I don't want that part of it. And it would be independently governed. So any advertising company that wanted to join into Unified ID 2.0 would have to agree to a strict set of standards and agree to being kind of reviewed and governed by this independent body. So This solution, again, similar principles. It keeps privacy there for the user. It allows for audience targeting because it would be able to track people's behavior still and build up that picture. But again, it would be all secure, all anonymized, and just much safer. So as advertisers, we'd still be able to go after that kind of car buying audience, but just in a much more secure way. Now, remarketing or retargeting. So this one, there will be lots of different solutions for. One that is being talked about at the moment is by Google's privacy sandbox. You'll hear reference to turtle dove, or you might hear reference to fledge. It's going through a bit of a naming crisis at the moment. Now, with this, it works in a way, again, similar to what we were talking about with the privacy sandbox, where the data is stored in this secure place. The behavioral data is still there, held by Google in a secure walled garden that we can access to for the purposes of remarketing. So just like remarketing at the moment, where a user might visit a website and leave without purchasing, and we want to remarket to them to try and get them to come back and purchase, we'd still have access to that level of information and we could still target them. But rather than us being able to see, here are the individuals who came and we tagged them with a cookie and they left and we want to go after them, all of that information would be held securely and privately by Google, but then given to us just to advertise to. So we wouldn't be able to layer on any of the interest data or segment that data, but we would still have access to it for the purposes of advertising. And again, from the user's point of view, much more secure because their individual data is being kept in a secure and safe way. So with this solution, there's, again, more details will come out about it in terms of the actual mechanisms of how it will work. And you can see there's some resources there at the bottom that explain it in a bit more detail. But essentially, remarketing would still be able to happen, but again, behind a kind of walled garden where the user's information was much more secure than it is currently. Now, another area for retargeting, which we already use, but will grow in importance as third-party cookies go away, and that's first-party data. So you likely at the moment collect some elements of first-party data on your website. Maybe when a customer is purchasing, you're collecting email address, name, address, other things. And that information can be stored, analyzed, and used for the purposes of advertising and targeting, as well as measurement. There's going to be more focus surely on first-party data in the future because it's going to be more and more valuable to individual companies to collect that information about their own customers and use it for the purposes of advertising. And so really the important thing at this time, before third-party cookies go away, is really getting to grips with exactly what you are collecting from a first-party point of view. So firstly, what information are you gathering about the people that visit your website? How is that being collected? A really important thing to think about with that is, what is that value proposition? Why is the customer giving you that information? If it's for a purchase, then fine, that makes sense. If you're just trying to gather information from people when they land on the site for the purpose of advertising, well, there needs to be a clear value proposition there. Why is it beneficial for the user to give you that information? And then, of course, it's really important that we look at, well, how is that information being stored? And then how is it being utilized and connected? How is it being connected to all your different advertising areas? So there's a lot to think about with first party data. And what we would say is kind of the biggest overarching piece of advice is just really get to grips with where you're at with your first party data and make sure you're on top of where is it all? What are you collecting? Is it safe? And do you know what you have? To help with that, we have this flow chart, which kind of lays out the process you should go through when looking at first-party data. The first thing is to define your business objectives, which should be pretty straightforward. What are you trying to achieve with the website? What are you trying to get customers to do online? And what are the marketing goals? So once you know what your marketing goals are, it's much easier to define, well, what do we need to collect from people to achieve those marketing goals? So once you understand all of that, you then go, okay, so if this is what we're trying to do, what do we need to collect from people to understand all of that? So whether that be name, email address, date of birth, anything like that, what do we want to collect? Then how are we going to analyze that information? So how are we actually going to process all of that data that we've collected from people? Obviously making sure that it's secured, it's safe, and that it's accessible by those individuals if they want to delete their data out of it. And then finally, once we're happy with what we've collected, we're happy that we're analysing it in the right way, we're happy that we're storing it correctly, how are we then going to activate on it? So in other words, how is that going to connect to everywhere we want to advertise or measure with, say, analytics? And yeah, how are we going to use all of that data to our benefit? Now, moving on more into measurement and attribution, one thing I wanted to talk about briefly was consent mode from Google. Now, the reason I want to talk about this is not because it is a direct solution for third-party cookies, but the mechanisms behind it kind of highlight where we will go with the death of third-party cookies. So with consent mode, a user can land on a site and then Google can give that person the option to opt in or opt out different targeting. So they might opt in to allow for advertising, allow for analytics tracking, and so on and so forth. In other words, giving the user control over what is being tracked about them. Now, obviously, with that, you're always going to get a number of people who completely opt out, who don't want anything tracked about them. So when that happens, we then have data modeling. So whereas historically the journey would be like the top, where we wouldn't ask for consent, we would just track everyone with third-party cookies, regardless of who they were. We just track everyone who came to the site. You would have, say, 100 people who landed, 10 converted, and you'd know you had a conversion rate of 10%. But what you wouldn't know is, did those people consent for that data being collected? What we might have now is that 100 people land, 70 users consent, 70 say they're happy to be tracked, but 30 decline, and so we can't track them directly. However, what we can do is look at the behavior of the 70 that did consent, and then we can model that up to cover all 100 people. So essentially, we know who's consented, we look at how all of those people behave, and then we go for everyone that hasn't consented, let's apply the same principles. Let's assume that that group work in the same way. Now, consent mode is actually nothing new. It's been, sorry, not consent mode, data modeling is nothing new. It's been used already a number of times for things like cross-device tracking before we were able to do that accurately. You could use data modeling to say, well, for where we can track people as they move across device, let's just apply that same data learning to everyone that we can't track. But this is going to be one of the key ways that we can do sophisticated data analysis in the future if we don't have full consent mode and we don't have full visibility. In other words, if we have a time once third-party cookies are gone and we give them more privacy controls back to individuals, if we have loads of people just completely opting out, we still want to be able to show how those people likely performed, and data modeling is going to be the key way we do that. Now, in a similar vein, if we look at the issue of frequency capping, which we talked about earlier, which is essentially making sure that users aren't just served the same ad over and over again all day, currently we get around frequency capping by using third-party cookies by saying, if you can see that that user ID has been served an ad 5 times already, don't show them the ad anymore. This is, again, something that could be solved with data modeling or machine learning. So essentially, just like with that consent mode, what we could look at is show us everyone who is opted in where we can understand what's happening with them, and let's see what behaviors they have that lead up to them seeing the ad the optimum amount of times. So let's say that's 3 times, and then we don't want them to see the ad anymore. Well, we could take all those learnings from the people that we are able to track and apply them to the people we aren't able to track, and basically say, well, from what we understand from these ones we can track is that when people have visited X number of pages or spent this much time online, they will have been served the ad the optimum number of times, so stop serving it to them. So again, it's using that modeling, it's using that machine learning to just understand where we can track all the information and apply it to where we can't track the information, and make sure that we do the same thing. Now, jumping to a slightly different solution on the measurement and attribution, this one really relates to Facebook. So although Facebook is a walled garden and a closed environment in terms of ad targeting, it does still use third-party cookies. And at the moment, the majority of people using Facebook ads would use the Facebook pixel on their website to track conversions and track behavior on their site. Now, Google have already come up with a solution that they would like people to move to, which is an API or server-to-server connection instead of using a pixel. So in other words, a user lands on the site, and rather than a third-party cookie pixel kind of following them around and tracking them, again, the client's actual server would track the information and pass that information securely back to Facebook in a server-to-server connection. So the data is completely private, completely secure between those two servers. Now, this solution is a great solution from Facebook, but it is quite dev heavy. So it does take some time and effort to get this in place. Again, we have a year pretty much until third-party cookies are going away, and this is something that will be worked on over time. So don't worry about rushing to get a change from Pixel to server to server right now, but it's something definitely to kind of have in the back of mind to look at for later in this year. And finally, we have Google Analytics 4. So I would imagine most people watching this use Google Analytics, and at the moment that is referred to as Universal Analytics, which is essentially Google Analytics 3. But there is a new one that is coming out, which is Google Analytics 4. Now, the first thing to note with this, again, don't worry about rushing away and upgrading to Google Analytics 4 today. There's still plenty of time. Universal Analytics isn't going anywhere anytime soon. But basically, Google have developed this to prepare for that future without third-party cookies and to prepare for a more data private world. So essentially, Analytics 4 won't rely on the use of cookies. It will be much more private, but it will still help you measure everything just as you do at the moment. But again, it will rely on some of those principles we've already talked about. It will rely more on things like data modeling and machine learning as opposed to just third-party cookie tracking. So Analytics 4, again, there's some resource there at the bottom that's worth reading, but this will become more and more prevalent as we go to 2022, and it's something that we will be working with our clients to get everyone upgraded to in the future. So, as you can see, there's a lot of different potential solutions out there to solve a lot of different potential issues. And again, the point is that there isn't one silver bullet. There's going to be loads of different solutions for it, but hopefully you can see there's not too much reason to panic at the moment, because all of these tech giants and agencies like us are working on all of these solutions to make sure that when third-party cookies go away, there isn't any kind of gap in activity or sudden massive falls in tracking or targeting. There will be solutions to all of those issues. But in terms of next steps, we have this little roadmap that might help kind of lay out what you should do over the next year. Now, step one is essentially understand the situation, which hopefully after this session you do. Basically, it's much easier to understand what you might have to do over the next year if you can just get a firmer grasp on why this is happening and what some of those potential solutions could be. So, as well as watching this video today, we would also recommend that you have a look at the latest blog post on our website about this situation, but also out there in the industry. There's lots of good resources online at the moment about this, and it's definitely worth taking some time to research and have a look and get a full picture of exactly what's happening. After that, kind of moving into Q2 of this year, what we'd say the next best step to do is assess your exposure level. So understand what you currently do that uses third-party cookies. Now, if you work with us at Space and Time, what we'll be doing is looking at all of our clients' digital activity, and we will be helping you understand this is your kind of portfolio at the moment, and this is what uses third-party cookies, and this is what we need to solve for. Away from us, obviously, anything else that you're running either in-house or running through other agencies, it's definitely worth speaking to all of them and looking at where you do use third-party cookies. Now, if that's with a direct relationship with a media provider, with an ad platform, it's 100% worth just reaching out to them and saying, hey, we use your ad platform. Can you tell us what your plan is with regards to third-party cookies? And 9 times out of 10, they're going to have a pretty robust plan already, or know what they're going to do about it. So again, if you're working with us, we'll be helping you through that. Anything you're doing away from us, definitely worth reaching out to them and assessing that exposure level. So once you understand the situation and you understand where you might be at risk, the next thing we think that you should really have a look at is getting to grips with your first party data. So kind of Q3 2021, having a look at making sure you're in complete control of your first party data. So essentially, what are you collecting? Why are you collecting it? How is it being stored? And is it being connected to everything else that you're doing? Now, again, if you work with space and time, what we will be doing is introducing you to our insights team, and this is something that we can help you with. We can help you understand what you're tracking at the moment, how your CRM maybe plugs into all your different ad providers, and what you could be getting out of all that. But for yourselves, it's definitely worth having an understanding of what you're collecting at the moment. And again, speaking to your CRM provider and talking to them about, how can we utilize this data in the future? How can we make sure it's all being collected properly, analyzed properly, and activated across our ad channels properly? But yeah, again, we can help you with that kind of later in this year. And then finally, if you've done all that, you should be in a pretty good spot to start future planning and just make sure we put the solutions in place going into 2022. So towards the end of this year, again, anything that you are doing with space and time directly, we'll be making sure that there are solutions in place for all of those different bits. So as we roll into 2022, there's no breaking activity or breaking performance. We just have all of the new solutions in place for what's currently being run using third-party cookies. But again, at that point, for anything that you're not doing through us, it's definitely worth reaching out to those individual ad providers or agencies and making sure that they, at that point, have plans in place so that when we come into the Q1 of 2022, you're not going to see any sudden drops in performance or ad serving or tracking. And that is it. So if you have any further questions, please reach out to your Space and Time account manager, or you can visit us at spaceandtime.co.uk where you'll find more information and find ways to contact us. I hope that has been useful, and yeah, enjoy. Hopefully it doesn't seem as scary as it did at the start. Thanks a lot for your time. Cheers.